Hello, fellow tamers and DigiDestined. It's Mike, aka Sinaku from Team Overground, and today we're continuing on with our How I Became a DigiDestined series. So today in episode 4, we're chatting with George, aka Espira, and we're going to be talking about his transition and migration, I guess, from Dragon Ball Super Card Game to Digimon. So George, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep. Hey, I'm glad to be here. Glad to have you take me on, Michael. Love your stuff, love your content. But I'm a general all-purpose channel. A lot of channels tend to focus on, competitive content or skits or discussions. I like to think, okay, if I was coming into the card game, what would I want to know going into it? So that's where the biggest staple of my channel, which is DBS and now Digimon, are the R-Type 101s, where I break down what a deck is trying to do, what kind of play style it's like, give you a feel and vibes like this. If anyone new or old is trying to figure out specifically what something does in a game, well, you got a 10-minute video right there to break down exactly how that's going to come together. And then you splash a little bit of gameplay here, you splash a little bit of discussion and ban reactions here, and then that's basically the all-around of my channel. As if I can make things as newcomer friendly for the game and push the game to grow in terms of making it easy to transition into being a competitive or long-term player, then that's the basic goal of my channel.
And you, like me, you've kind of picked among the buffet of card games throughout the years or so.
Oh yeah, I've
Taking
jumped
your hand in everything.
absolutely. I've jumped all over the map. So it started off with Magic the Gathering. Yeah. So Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh when I was a teenager, but usually there we weren't playing with sleeves. We played with whatever cards I got on my birthday. So like as much as I did play the card game with friends, I wouldn't really say that was the full Yu-Gi-Oh experience at the time. Really jumping into a card game, Magic the Gathering was the first one I did. Buddy of mine got me into it. I played for like a month or two, dropped it, and then like just about every card game, you never really quit a game. You just take a hiatus and come back.
Yeah.
So got back into Magic when I moved to the big city after my studies. Did that for a couple of years. And then between transitioning from that to Dragon Ball, I did Hearthstone, Eternal, Feria, basically a smattering of any card game I can get my hands on, just because the strategy aspect of card games, I absolutely lose myself in. So I've touched almost everything on my way to getting to Digimon.
Yeah, no, I believe it because I'm pretty much in the same boat. Because card games in general for me has always been my favorite pastime, my favorite kind of hobby, and I never knew exactly what about it was that drew me in. But I think it's like I said, it's the strategy aspect of it that kind of really draws you in and kind of gets you thinking. Because it's one of those games where there's never there's a set of rules per se based on how
Hmm.
to play the game, but in terms of this, like it's not like a board game where it's just like I know this is my main objective and I have to do XYZ to get there. In a trading card game, you have your objective, but there's like so many lines of play and so many branches you can take in any given game at any given time, and I've always appreciated that aspect the most.
I think it's that deep, like you said, just lines of play that I can make, and also the little variants add in there. Now, I don't like games that are too random, but I think the little randomness where my hand is different any given game. The sequence of draws I'm gonna get are different every single game, and it's up to me to craft the best lines of play I can with the tools that were given to me to be able to play out a
Yeah.
victory. And it's never guaranteed. Sometimes you lose to the top deck, which sucks, and sometimes you win to the top deck, which feels like you can't be stopped. So I think it's that meld of that excitement and change of pace every single game. On top of, if you are more strategic and you play out better, you're not always, but you are more likely to push for a win. So those are things that I find very attractive about the genre.
And I like that imagery of crafting and building, because not only are you building your deck, but you're also building out your win condition based off what you've been able to kind of see in the confines of your hand, outside of other outside sources like drawing or other consistency factors. It's literally these are the tools, these are in my hand, this is what I must craft my victory with. I really like that imagery.
Yep, absolutely. Because like, hey, Omni Blue, how
Yeah,
many times do we end up having to go Rookie Rush? So
exactly. Or Mega Rush sometimes for me, but that's beside the point.
yeah.
So, based on all that to do with card games, what was it about DBS specifically that kind of drew you into it
So
and got you kind of launched off there?
I always love the resource aspect of Magic the Gathering. I think it was a great balancing
Okay.
factor in terms of choosing, what lines you're going to play, but it restricts you, but it's also generic enough that it's open. And Dragon Ball actually has that aspect. But the feel bad aspect about Magic the Gathering is that you need to play lands in your deck to make that work. So You end up losing a
Mhm.
significant amount of games to non-draws, and like that hurts
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really bad. But I still love the aspect of color identities and like different colors play out differently. Blue bounces, red is direct burn damage, so on and so forth. Dragon Ball incorporates that aspect, but instead of having lands, all your cards serve as a land of that source that you can play one for a turn. So you get those aspects of the game where you have that resource management that not only creates a color identity and a kind of like extra depth to the game, but it allows them to go deep in terms of, I always say Dragon Ball is like a meld of Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh, because a lot of archetypes play out like Yu-Gi-Oh, where like you have a searcher that goes get a certain card that plays this card, and if you kill this card I get a floating effect that able to do something, but with the balancing factor that there's costs. Everything costs resources on the board, which means you get that really high octane gameplay, but you're able to pull back the brakes design wise as far as the game goes, because everything's associated to colors and costs. And I think that is super awesome. And even beyond that aspect, every single one of your creatures, we could say, even if they're not on board, you can combo away during the damage step to protect yourself from taking damage. So every card basically has 2 to 3 uses between your hand and the board, which means you always have something to do. So I gotta say, so Dragon Ball ends up being like very consistent with that dabble of variance that you need to really make it work out. And I think it's that beautiful meld of all those components between the high octane Yu-Gi-Oh gameplay, the resource management aspect, as well as just always having something to do. That's really attracted me about Dragon Ball. And of course, it's the Dragon Ball IP, which I grew up my entire life with. It was really hard to say no to.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question, because the Dragon Ball IP has been around like since the '80s for all intents and purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually a little bit older than you, so I've actually had a bit more exposure, I guess, to Dragon Ball, and yet for me personally, I chose this.
All
So,
right.
what is it about the Dragon Ball IP specifically that kind of drew you in? I mean, outside of the obvious, but uh, what were you a fan of the IP before you were a fan of the card game, or were you a fan of the IP because of the card game?
I was a fan of the IP before the card game. I grew up
Okay.
with Dragon Ball, basically from my youth up until today. It's all I've ever known in terms of my first exposure to like anime, Japan, and all that jazz has always been Dragon Ball. I've played every like Tenkaichi Budokai game in the consoles and stuff. So the IP was something that I was really tied to in terms of getting something to play. And actually, the decision to pick up Dragon Ball was because I ended up moving from the big city, Montreal, if you guys know Canadian cities, back to my hometown. So a lot of my Magic community I ended up leaving behind, and I didn't really feel like starting all that back up here. So I had the choice between 2 card games. I was telling myself, okay, well, I like the Final Fantasy franchise. I like the Dragon Ball franchise. They both have card games that are out right now. First off, thank God I picked Dragon Ball because I think Final Fantasy is dead. But no
Not to
bite to
those three
anyone.
guys at locals that play it though.
Yeah. Hey guys, if your community ain't dead, then I'm great for you. I'm very happy to hear that. But Dragon Ball ended up being the easy pick because I ended up getting some friends and my brother into it because they also love Dragon Ball. So the IP is what I was able to start my own little community with it. And then from there, the card play is really what just kept me going up until where we are now. But I think having a strong IP is very, very important. Either that or your gameplay has to be impeccable. And like we see with the Digimon, I think they found a good balance of the two, which is what's leading to its great success right now.
So based on that statement too, the fact that we have 2 IPs that have been around, Dragon Ball since the '80s, Digimon since the '90s, both big multimedia franchises. We have anime, we have video games, we have board games. We have got everything.
Mhm.
Why do you think it took us over 20 years for both of these IPs to finally get a card game where they got it right?
That's the thing, right? Because all of them have had card games. With Dragon Ball, you've had the
Mhm.
Panini card games. Before that, you had something else. Hell, even in Japan, they don't even play our version. They play Heroes, which is like an arcade version of the card game. Digimon, you had those sick Digimon cards that I collected. I don't even know how, but I just had them. But Lord knows how that game was played. I'm sure you could
Yeah,
explain it to me if we sat down for it. But I think the
hyper
big, I think the biggest thing was just, I want to say gameplay wasn't very intuitive for a lot of those games. First off, and they really stuck to just way too hard on the IP and not enough of it just being like a good game. Like
yeah.
you could strip away the IP from either of these games and I would actually enjoy them quite a bit. They'd be fun as any other thing. The IP adds on to that experience and makes it easier for people to come and jump into it. But in terms of resaying it over and over, I think it's a mix of like commitment. They're just not committed to seeing how hard they could push it. And I think it's we've seen this a lot with not only Digimon but with the Dragon Ball franchise. They're franchises that switch hands a lot. Between their video games, between the media that they make, between like it just feels like it's not as in-house as, let's say, Pokemon. Pokemon was Wizards of the Coast, and after Wizards of the Coast, it was the Pokemon Company, and that's it.
Yeah,
Wizards of the Coast has always been Wizards of the Coast. Whereas it feels like every time, Digimon or Dragon Ball tried something new, it was, this company giving their hand at it, or this company giving their hand at it. And then, they had like 2 to 3 years to make it work. And if it didn't work, okay, well, we're scrapping the whole thing. So it feels like up until now, and here's to hoping to get it right, because like Naruto did really well, and they Bandai scrapped Naruto. So we're still in the beginning phase where I think they're trying to decide if they can make it. But I think the big thing is one, like commitment. And I think at this point they've realized what works and what doesn't work. And we finally got to a place where the gameplay makes a ton of sense. It's very appealing. It's very easy to pick up, but there's depth to it. Plus, right now, both IPs are having big pushes. Dragon Ball Super had the Broly movie a couple of years ago, is doing well. Digimon has the movie that came out, and now they have the Adventure reboot, which is like bringing it back to the audience forefront. So I think it's just a mesh of like, right now is a prime time because both franchises are kind of seeing a revival. And at the same time, I think the games are just flat out good. Versus they were a bit obtuse. And also, we're talking a time when like the market was flooded with card games. Like, there was a Harry Potter card game. There was like everyone and their mother had a card game. So I think now we've gone to a point where people are used to card games and they just pick up the ones that are good, they have fun with. And I think that's just kind of the perfect storm that brought together kind of what seems like we have stable games now that will probably stick around.
Now, saying this is probably a little bit of a misdemeanor because Digimon's literally in its infancy, but you're the first guest I've had that has also played other Bandai card games specifically, or that's at least your main kind of go-to and which you're kind of coming to Digimon from. And like you said, in terms of like in-house, Bandai is the master toy licensor for most toy animation things. So the fact that Bandai kind of has the reins on both Dragon Ball and Digimon in terms of a toy and card game, I feel like it's kind of good because that's the main company that toy would be going to on a regular basis anyway. And you talk about kind of how the Naruto card game kind of fell by the wayside as well. Do you feel that Digimon has the potential to kind of go the same distance that Dragon Ball has reached up to this point as well in terms of being a Bandai card game specifically?
I think it can. Even just like from like a back end aspect, I'm fairly certain that Bandai has better control over the Digimon IP than they do Dragon Ball IP from conversations I've had in the past. So first off, that just makes it easier. Okay. Yeah, so first off, that just makes it easier for them to deal with it if they have more control over the IP. But additionally, I think they can. I think in terms of what they did with Dragon Ball, they found a formula that worked. Especially seeing how this game is actually doing very well in Japan. So I think the one up that Digimon has over Dragon Ball is the fact that the card game itself is actually global. Whereas for Dragon Ball Super, the game is actually outside Asia Pacific. So it's Europe, Latin America, and North America, and that's it. So the fact that the Digimon game is actually global, I think will make it easier in terms of getting a world circuit out and making it meaningful. In terms of understanding, how well sets are doing and stuff. Japan's ahead of us, and if it was doing well over there, it's projections that it'll actually do well here, and hopefully the pre-sale numbers show that it is very successful here. So I think there's a number of aspects in regards to just the logistics of it. In terms of who plays the game, how much access they have, and the IP itself, and how much control they have, that means that they can probably push it through. Plus, they have the 6-foot formula. Dragon Ball worked. It's the exact same house. It's the exact same card game company that are doing the exact, not the exact same thing. It's a different card game with a different model. But understanding what worked, what didn't work, and be able to push that forward. So I think having something that was able to break the ice first, fumble, because Dragon Ball did fumble here and there, and the devs. What I love is that the devs are very open, and I hope that there's that continued push in Digimon as well, because it does feel like there is actual community feedback loop between the players and the devs. And You have that icebreaker, and I think if Digimon just follows suit with everything that worked with Dragon Ball, they'd probably are in a very sweet line to actually make it all the way push this time. It is still in its infancy, like you said. Japan's only jumping now into their
Yeah.
fourth set and about to be in their fifth set soon. So it is still within their first 2 years, which is typically 2 years. Then maybe the game
A make or
dies.
break. Yeah.
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 So if the game passes its 2 years, then I think we'll be in a reliable spot to say, okay, this game is probably gonna stick around.
Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about just talk about Digimon specifically for the next little bit, because you
Sure.
mentioned the global circuit, and you had actually made a video kind of expressing some concerns with
Mhm.
how we're falling behind from the Japanese sets. So I know in Dragon Ball, like you said, it's outside of Asia, but everywhere in those continents, they receive the Dragon Ball sets all at the same time, correct?
That is absolutely correct. It wasn't for a
Where,
while.
yeah.
Europe was behind, but eventually they made an initiative to catch up Europe, and now we're all on the same plane.
Mm. So what I want to talk about here is that in the sense that we're still technically behind, but I mean, it looks like Bandai's making strides to catch up with us because now they've finally given us the date for set five, which is actually going to be June, which is 1 month following set four,
Hmm.
which means now we're not actually going to be as far behind as we thought. So all that means that maybe once we get six, we should theoretically be on the same plane. How important is a world circuit to you when it comes to any launch of a TCG?
I think it's real. I think it's very important. First off, I think just from like a player's perspective, I think you know the whole exploring the meta is such a huge aspect of going into any new set of a card game, and I think it's really important to let players be a part of that if they want to, because it's huge in terms of driving community. When there's the first couple of tournaments, it's not only just your community that's keeping an eye on it, but Japan keeps an eye on it, and Latin America keeps an eye on it, because this is the first new set tournament. What's good? What doesn't work? And it feels like there's a whole momentum to the fact that everyone gets their first hands on cards versus everyone else. And I think, and then looking even deeper on that, I want to see, hey, can I break the meta? Is there something that no one's really thought of? And you get ripped away from a lot of that when it's not a global release. Like no one was shocked that Omnimon was best deck when 1.0 came out. And it's one of those things where I think we need to be given the opportunity to explore just as much as anybody else. And I think that is the biggest factor in terms of we should be all getting the cards in one spot. And then you add on top of the fact that being on the same set release means that it's easier to do things like the world circuits, tournaments and all that jazz. And that's actually really good for the growth of the game and star building in the game and all that jazz. And then you could have Japan versus North America and all those kind of, everything ridiculous that comes with that. I think you just make it so much easier when the game is always on the same plane. Whereas I think with a lot of other card games, they mitigate that. So Pokemon has like a weird rotation system, but essentially the rotation system they have out in Japan isn't the same that they have in the rest of the world. So they play out differently there. In Yu-Gi-Oh, you have exclusive archetypes that are exclusive only to the TCG. So that their card pool is different. And it's not always guaranteed when they actually get cards in their sets. Their set builds are different. So I think those are ways you can mitigate that kind of fact. So to hear that the sets are coming in, it sounds like they're crunching it in there, and which, I mean, does have its downsides.
Slowly.
When Dragon Ball was
Yeah.
pushing Europe to catch up to the rest of the world, it did kind of suck because it meant they got a new set every month and a month, which is really tough on wallets. It's really tough on players. But I think it's that kind of tough ground you kind of have to walk through that sees its endless bounds of benefits moving forward when everything gets merged in. But it really just comes down to me wanting to be one of those players who's like, I cracked this deck, I figured it out, we pushed the new deck, we figured out the strategy, and that sends waves across the community. And I think that's the kind of thing that everyone should be a part of, not just us 2 to 3 months later taking deck profiles from Japan and incorporating it into our gameplay.
And unfortunately, we're stuck like that for now, and at least for another 6 months or so.
Mhm.
Because until we get our hands on set 4 and 5, we're kind of stuck following the Japanese metagame up to that point. Did you have a similar situation in Dragon Ball with the whole Europe situation where they were just kind of already kind of knew the format by the time they got their sets?
Yes and no. So essentially, a lot of European builds, when they were still behind, were bent off of things that they picked up from North America. The one differentiating factor is that promo releases weren't exactly as consistent as the rest. So sometimes they would have weird formats that we'd actually never played just because the pushing out the product has always been tough in Europe. So for that aspect, it was sometimes weird where they'd have odd formats, but for the most part, usually what you would see would be a lot of them pulling what they saw from the North American formats and just running it themselves. I will say though that there is some regional differences in how players play decks. North American players lean more towards what's meta. European players will tend to lean towards value decks, from what I've noticed. And then, like, let's say Asian competitors that I've played against and I've commentated on and such will lean towards combo control. Now, obviously, they all end up splashing over each other. So the one okay I feel about the entire situation is just that because of the different ways in which different regions play the game and strategize, just based on North Americans being more aggressive, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
I hear that a lot actually. Yeah.
yeah, so we end up playing the game differently, which means our meta does break down a little bit differently than we see elsewhere. But for the most part, yeah, I would say when Europe was still behind, you would tend to see them just try and pull what they can from our format when it came to over there.
So based on that, different regions kind of play a little bit differently. Based on what we know of the Japanese meta from what their equivalent of 1.5 would have been, we know that kind of like the top three decks, I guess, were like Shine, Imperial Dramon, or top four decks, including the Red Omni now with Alter S, and then they had a new variant of Rookie Rush as well. Out of
Mhm.
those four, which ones do you think the North Americans will kind of latch onto the most?
I mean, first off, Red Omni would be like an easy pick, just to say
Yeah.
people already have their Omnimons. You're just slapping more Omnimons into an Omnimon deck. um, but so I want to say that one just because the thing with red is that so the difference we could talk about in terms of red versus blue Omnimon is that while blue wins more consistently just based on the fact that it sees more cards and stuff, red wins harder. You get more security checks, you have more aggressive megas. So I think in that point, I see a lot of players still leaning towards red just because they like that hard push aggro.
Mhm.
Otherwise, though, I will say Shine Greymon, just because it Shine Greymon feels like a cheat deck in terms of you're kind of just playing your own game. You're not interacting with your opponent all that much. You're playing a bunch of tamers that kind of give you value, but you're not like dealing with what your opponent is doing, and then you're just slapping a big mega that board wipes them. So I think North American players like playing unfair decks. I really really do. So I
Okay.
think
Interesting. Yeah.
in 1.5 we're going to see probably those two be the biggest things in terms of what
Oh, and
people ought to play.
uh, Ceresbon, forgot to mention that one too. Sorry,
Yeah, of course, there's
but
Ceresmon. So
he,
Ceresmon is super strong, but we do see
mhm.
people play control decks less. So
Yeah,
while I think it's
that's
super
what. Yeah,
powerful, I don't think that's what people will be running the most of. Although I love Ceresmon, I think it's gonna be a ton of fun.
yeah. I find North Americans kind of stray away from that control. They're very much aggro robust when it comes to specific card games anyway. Um, but yeah, okay. So with that in mind, what kind of were the formats in Dragon Ball that you felt were the most appealing to you specifically? Did you prefer the control ones, or did you prefer the aggro ones, or like in the mid range or anything like that?
I'm not gonna say the aggro. Here's the thing: I played the degenerate decks when it was the aggro deck formats, and I had a ton of fun with it. But I can recognize that my opponents didn't so much, and that the format would have been better without it. Explicitly because there's no summoning sickness in Dragon Ball, which means when aggro is the oppressive format in the game, it's to a really harsh degree. Just because you have so few turns to be able to find answers you need to deal with what they're doing, because they're deploying threats and they're attacking right away, which means very few times is an aggro deck making a play that doesn't immediately get them value. So even if you deal with it, they probably already dealt damage to you or something like that. So in general, I've liked more open formats where it feels like the game goes to turn 4, turn 5, where you can really hash out your game plans. It's not unrealistic, and there have been some formats where turn 2 is like very consistent and capable in the card game. And you can still do that now to some extent, but we have more answer cards to be able to deal with that.
Mhm.
So I'd say in terms of I prefer the middle ground. I don't like too control heavy because like I love control decks, and like I find I'm pretty good at mitigating the control mirror. Um, but it makes for really long days. And like if everyone was playing the same deck I was playing, like I would just not be about it. So I think a mid-range format where like you kind of have the entire array be capable, and where pilot skill is really what makes the mitigating difference, instead of, hey, I played an aggro deck and did you find your answers? No, then I win. I think are the ones where I really end up enjoying it the most.
And you talked about how, especially when you're comparing to stuff like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, when it comes to their set rotations and their ban lists, Dragon Ball does have a ban list, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And how often does that get updated?
Before it used to be spontaneous. We
Okay.
kind of just found out when we found out, kind of like how Yu-Gi-Oh used to do it. Now we're promised ban list updates every core set release. That doesn't mean something's going to happen, because for the most part, they're straying away from doing, usually, Bandai has strayed away from doing what Yu-Gi-Oh does, where they're not using the ban list to shape the format. They use the ban list only for cards that are deemed broken or just happen to warp the game to a point where it's prohibitive or unenjoyable for the player base.
It's sometimes a marketing tool, not gonna lie.
And sometimes a marketing tool. I'm not gonna lie. Dragon Ball banned this. They created a card when they brought in their first multicolor cards. It's Android 21 Violent Predator, and it basically says when you play this card, destroy all the energy, which is like the memory or the resource system, and all battle cards your opponent that are monocolored, effectively pushing every single deck pre that format out of the game, because it's an auto win the moment it hits board. The moment 3 sets later, once the multicolor block got rotated out and they went back to a monocolor focused format, they banned her. So clearly shaping out what the meta was supposed to be. It's like, oh, okay, we're going to force all monocolors out of the game. Yeah. Oh no, now we're doing only monocolors. Let's get it back in. So that's the one, like they've done that once, maybe twice, but for the most part, and we didn't have a ban list from the beginning. It only came in, I want to say, once Mecha Frieza, which is about like set 3, I think, was really broken and like took over like 60% of the meta or something like that. But it's the ban list is very much meant to just take away what's broken and not touch anything else, which is fun. I mean, it means that it's not set rotation, which means players who used to play the game can always take their old decks and bring them back in. And at least now it's on a more consistent, hey, every core set, we're going to have an update. And if you kind of understand the vibe of the meta, you can kind of pick up on what's about to shake and move, which I like. Although I have issues with ban lists personally, just because I don't like having anxiety every set release to know if my favorite deck is about to like get hosed. And when I was playing, and almost every game I play, my deck tends to be the degenerate one because I played degenerate decks. It just happens to be my favorite thing to do. And they always get banned. In Magic the Gathering, every single standard format, I had my main deck banned. So it's just
so I feel that.
Yeah, but I understand.
I feel that.
Yeah, so I understand why it exists, and I do get it. So if they take that kind of route with Digimon, if ever it gets there, I'd be looking forward to them just doing it on a as needed basis, as opposed to actually doing like a pseudo rotation where they kind of shape the format with the ban list.
And that was my next question, because just the way Digimon is designed as a whole, especially just the way the memory system exists, do you feel that there are any cards from what you've seen so far that are inherently unfair to the point where they would deserve the creation of a ban list? Or do you feel that this game would benefit more from something like a rotation down the road?
How much do I hate Puppetmon? Do I hate Puppetmon enough to say it needs to be banned? So far, no. But I will say the generic factor of the game makes it very tough to be like, we'll never need a ban list. Because every single level 4 can evolve on top of every single level 3, which can evolve on every single level 2, and you can do that all the way to level 7. And you can build your boss monster in any number of ways, which means the number of possible options in this card game are absolutely insane. Because you can build, there's almost an infinitesimal amount of stacks you can build in between every color and every variation of levels, which I think at some point there will be that combination that's just like absolutely busted. I don't doubt that. And I think the genericness of the game leads that at some point that's probably going to happen. And it's kind of why I think, even, I don't think the game needs sideboards. I'll take it if they have it. But even if we do have sideboards, I think 5 tops. Because this game is so generic that if I'm playing a red deck and I'm playing against purple, lol, okay, I'll side in my 4 Gallant Mons and that's a free win for me. So it's I think it's the game is designed. I love the design of the game because it means that it mitigates a lot of issues in terms of bricking because you can play anything on top of anything, and it really smooths out how the game plays. But I will say that it's a fine line they're treading because it's just almost impossible to design a card game where you're taking into account the probably hundreds of thousands of interactions in between every single level. So right now, do I think anything's busted? No. I think Puppetmon is an unfun card to play against, but at the same time, you can play around it by having things like a Garurumon in hand or setting up a bunch of blockers or stuff like that. So you can mitigate it. In terms of what we see coming up, I don't think anything's too busted either. I think you just have good decks, but I think one, if you know how to pilot it better, you could probably manage out against your opponent. So for the most part, I think the format's healthy right now. I think it's going to be healthy for a good while, from what I've seen from Japan. But I would be amiss to say this will be the case forever. I don't think that's going to
Yeah.
stick around forever, and I think rotation helps in that. Rotation does 2 things. First, it means that when you are testing for the format, you're testing within a more concise block, making it easier to get those tricky interactions. Two, it just means that there's more confidence in when my cards are going to go. Instead of praying every ban list that I don't lose something, I just
Yeah.
know that eventually it rotates out. And then what we could do is just have multiple formats, kind of like Magic does. You have Modern, Legacy, Commander, blah blah blah. You just incorporate that, and then there's 2 formats people can play to use every card or just standard. Whether you like it or not, I understand people not liking it because they don't like the fact that their decks rotate. I understand that point. But it has its uses, and I think whichever way, as long as it's transparent to the player, then it's fine.
So I'm of the personal opinion that I think rotation is going to have to happen in order to kind of keep the game balanced, because I'm afraid that due to how the game is designed as it is right now, that we might have the potential to kind of like have manufactured power creep as
Mm.
more sets come out. And I worry about that a little bit. Is that something that you felt affected Dragon Ball to some capacity before they introduced the ban list?
Yeah. So the way they push, so the way Bandai pushes new sets is power creep, and like it's not even like it's so insanely explicit. And it's explicitly what it's why the ban list came around, because one, the new
Hmm.
cards are all super pushed. And Bandai has this unfortunate thing where they tend to push really good cards in promos, which makes them hard to access. So it wasn't uncommon to see like a Cabo when that card first came out, which played a bunch of battle cards for free. Um, that was like easily like a $50 card in a promo that you could only get like every locals um, for participating in a tournament, and you get like 1 pack that week. So the power creep is definitely one of their core aspects in terms of pushing new product. So do I think they need rotation? I think Dragon Ball has survived long enough in that they do it in a way that, yes, it's power crept. Your set one deck will almost never win against one of the newer set decks. But the way that the game is built, it's not impossible either. You know, in Dragon Ball, we saw just last month in a big tournament invitational, a set one leader taking it down, because it just so happened that based on the new
Oh, yeah.
cards, yeah, based on the fact of the new cards they brought out for it and the pilot, they were able to take it all the way. And it's one thing I will say, Bandai is really good about supporting old archetypes. They're very good with printing new cards that boost up old archetypes. So
Oh yeah, we see a million Omnimons already.
yeah, exactly. Every single Omnimon. But so while they do power creep, I think I don't see them doing rotation. It doesn't feel like a very Japanese way of doing things, given other card games in Japan that I've played for before, and just the trend I'm seeing with the way Bandai wants to do things. It is going to be power creep. I mean, I think set 5, set 4, set 3 stuff blow set 1 stuff out of the water. It's not even close. So it's something to keep in mind, but I think in general they're going to be fine. I think they'll stick to a ban list. But from the way they've been doing it in Dragon Ball, it seems to be light and only when necessary.
All right. I want to circle back to the comment you made about always wanting to play the degenerate decks, because you've been on Omni Blue pretty much since the beginning.
Yeah.
What about that deck classifies it as a George standard degeneracy, or is this kind of an exception?
It's not that much of an exception. It just tends to be the highest power ceiling thing you can do in the game. I'm in Magic. I love playing big bodies. In Dragon Ball, my first deck that I was known for was a deck that can kill you with 1 hit. So I just like big stupid things that happen on like and break the game while doing it. So in set 1.0, it really feels like Omnimon is that thing because nothing else matches its power ceiling. Oftentimes when I'm playing another deck and I'm playing green, I'm playing purple, and like I love playing those decks. They're super fun. Like I've taken them to tournaments and everything. But sometimes you're just kind of sitting on a level 6 that's like a vanilla with a bunch of inheritables, and you're just like, okay, well this is cool. Whereas when you're playing Blue Omni, it's like, okay, well I just played this thing. I just played this Garurumon that gave me 2 free bodies. I drew a card, and now I'm playing on top of them to like kill your biggest threat. Oh, and none of your threats are big enough to kill it. So it very much lines up in just being one of those very quick high power ceiling things I like to do. In Magic the Gathering, if I play Modern, I'm playing Tron, which means on turn 3 I'm playing things I'm supposed to only be able to play on turn 7. If I'm playing Historic, on turn 4 I'm playing 10 drops. In Dragon Ball, I would play, like I said, the battle card that had the skill that said if I deal damage to my opponent, I win the game. It's similar to a Victory Dragon in Yu-Gi-Oh, but for only that one game. Oh, and I can get that card out on turn 4. And I tap down all your resources when I did it. So it very much lines up with my style of play where I just want to do the highest power ceiling thing the game has to do. I want to play the biggest, chunkiest monster, and I want to do it really cheaply and really aggressively. So that's why Omnimon really sings to me in terms of how the deck plays, because I kind of don't have to care about what my opponent is doing. And I think a deck that does that too well is bad for the game. And I'm open enough to say, as much as I love those decks, if it's to a point where it's unhealthy for the format because you're just actually playing solitaire, then at that point the deck should go. But I do like my solitaire decks. I like being it's basically the statement that you know exactly what I'm about to do and it doesn't even matter because I'm gonna do it to anyways and you can't stop me. And that's basically what Omnimon feels to me like when I looked into the card game and decided to pick up the deck.
So, coming from Dragon Ball specifically and kind of sliding into Digimon, what were some of the core kind of principles and philosophies that you brought with you from that game? Was it that feeling exactly of kind of knowing that you can understand a deck's power ceiling just by jumping into a game, or was there kind of something else that drew you into it, kind of mechanics wise, that you can say, "Oh, I know this from Dragon Ball. I can kind of take this specific kind of theory and way of playing and transplant it into a Digimon deck as well," or do you play Digimon kind of completely differently than how you would play any other card game?
Inherently, Digimon does play a little bit differently because it has summoning sickness. And because it has summoning sickness, it means that, one, the game is just inherently slower. And there is a bit more variance you need to account for because of security checks. In Dragon Ball, I never had to worry about my boss monster dying to a Guy Force. Whereas Lord knows that happens way too often. So you do have to go about it differently, but I think the transferables are things like, and I think any card game player can really take that away, is hand advantage. How do I make sure I make the plays that are most efficient to me having the most cards available in my hand? At what point can I bluff an attack to bait a blocker? Because there is blocker in Dragon Ball, so a lot of that is actually transferable. So how can I bait my attack to force the block? And even if I lose the resource, I just opened up so many lines of play for me to be able to close out the game. So I think it's oh, and also finally the life as a resource. In Dragon Ball, every time you take damage, it's like the Pokemon prize card system, except the opposite. So instead of whenever you take damage, the person dealing damage gets to take a card from their prize pool, the player taking the damage is taking that card back, which actually sets you up to have a comeback mechanic. And that's what I love about Dragon Ball also, is the fact that as you're losing, you're getting more hand advantage than your opponent, meaning that you're able to find more in your outs and be able to draw out the game. Digimon plays very similar in a way that your life, your security, is another resource, and you can actually play around that and mitigate for that. So I think the more skill players
is the comeback mechanic.
It is the comeback mechanic, right? Like I've lost games to a Night Raid in there. I've lost games to a Guy Force in there. I've won games to a Guy Force in there. So I think when you're pushing for the win, because I always push you need to play to win, not play to not lose. Okay, yeah, sure. If I set up 3 blockers this turn, I don't lose. And like if he has it, then like whatever. But that doesn't mean that like, okay, maybe I should actually just have 1 blocker and attack with these things. And then putting that means that my opponent needs to have it. And he beats me, fine, then great, he had it. Otherwise, I set up my win the next turn. Versus I set up to not lose, but now my game plan's so far behind that I'm just delaying my loss till like a turn or 2 later. So using that life as a resource thing and thinking about it, right? So what are my outs? Well, I can't win unless my last security is Spark. And I know I can choke my opponent out by making these line of plays, being aggressive, and that Sparks is that, and then I just win it out from there. That whole aspect of thinking, okay, what's in my life? Do I take the life? In Dragon Ball, you'll take it to be able to draw that extra card because based on what I've seen, if I draw my out in my life now, even though if it puts me in a closer position to dying, I might actually be able to push for the win next turn because I have an extra 5k combo or I found a combo piece or something like that. Very similar in Digimon. If I push for my attack, and then my last security is Hammer Sparks, and I guaranteed myself the win. Oftentimes, knowing how those outs are and understanding those aspects of your deck that give you the ability to go for the win is really what I think distinctifies players being able to finish with a top cut finish. So those aspects of mitigating your life as a resource is a huge aspect in Dragon Ball that I found super transferable to Digimon. Granted, it plays out differently. I think it's a bit more sacky because the abilities trigger right away and you can just lose your boss monster to an unlucky check, but those are just things you got to take into account for. And I think as the skill of the community bumps up, the more and more players will take those things into account and will be able to mitigate sacky life swips. Always no, but to a point where the better players will end up winning more, and the players who need more work will be looking to get better at those specific things to be able to improve their game.
And I want to talk about the life mechanic as well. So you get 6 life in Dragon Ball?
We get 8.
You get 8. Okay. So I'm going to compare this to Digimon. Do you feel that 8 life versus the speed of Dragon Ball, does that kind of scale well to the speed of Digimon with the 5? Or do you feel like Digimon could have benefited from maybe starting with a little bit more?
I want to say could have been fitted to a little bit more because Dragon Ball has the benefit that you have more interaction with how your opponent deals damage to you. In Digimon, the only real interaction you have on your opponent's turn is blocker and abilities like Rosemon, where if your opponent attacks, you get to rest one of their things. So in terms of actually having a decision point in how you take damage, there's very little you can do from preventing your opponent from Ricky rushing you. Um, and the game plays a lot like Hearthstone. Like when people ask me like what does Digimon play like, I tell them Hearthstone because it's very much that all right, here's all my questions, can you answer my questions? And it's kind of like that call back and forth style of gameplay. So it is tougher to compare because Dragon Ball has more interaction in terms of every card in your hand can be thrown away to protect yourself from taking damage. Additionally, Dragon Ball has no summoning sickness, so it accounts for the extra 2 you get. But Dragon Ball has more interaction. But at the same time, the card game's just starting. I could see them, we play a very basic version of the game in set 1.0 because it's them introducing the player base to how the game is played. And we get more complicated effects as the game moves on. At the point in time, I think 6 is fine, especially because you have cards that can blow up your opponent's board, can swing you the game towards your way. And I think having more life would just means more chances of having things like Gaia Forces in life. And I think that would be more detrimental to gameplay because it is relatively hard to actually kill your opponent in this game. If they get lucky with their security checks, then fine. They got lucky. It turns out all your rookies were in security. There's not much you could do about that anyways. But on the flip of that token, like what if your opponent's security is like all Gaia Force and all Megas? That means you're probably losing your best card every single time you're attacking into it. And giving more opportunities to that is kind of something you have to be careful with. So I think there's a balancing act there. I think 6 is probably enough. I think the game early on didn't account for how strong things like Ricky Rush would be in the game. Oftentimes
I was
just
gonna
flooding
touch
you.
on that, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, we see with the new set release that they're bringing out a tamer that hoses Ricky Rush. So, as much as I want to make a judgment on that, I think 6 for now is fine, especially given the fact that the game is still early and there's a lot of interaction that we still haven't gotten yet. And the horizons above show that they are taking those things into account when developing new sets. So overall, I think 6 is a good sweet spot for the game.
And so what are the levels of interaction on your opponent's turn? So you told me about the combo phase, and that's generally you can like throw extra cards into your hand, kind of increase your damage potential, right?
Yeah, so in terms of interaction, we have first, it plays very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh! Where every time your opponent does something, you have a window to answer. So if they play a card, you can play a counter to that card, which opens up another window that your opponent can counter your counter and just kind of go back and forth until everyone's okay, we're going to resolve the chain. So on that aspect, there's that. And in terms of taking damage, we have blockers, just like Digimon does. We have option cards that say like, nope, the attack doesn't happen, which is another set of defense that you have available. And there are variations of that don't actually stop the attack, but they nuke your opponent's potential damage so that it doesn't even matter. And then a layer even beyond that is the combo, which is essentially like, let's say you have a 10k power card versus my 10k leader, which the leader is like the representation of you. That's what's actually taking the damage. You can throw cards away when you're attacking to give it an extra 5k boost. So at the end of the offensive combo step, if you're attacking into me, you could throw away, let's say, 2 cards that are 5k combos. That would make it a 20k attacker. Now I need to get above that threshold to be able to defend myself. So I would pitch, let's say, 3 cards for 5k each, putting my leader at 25, and then I prevented myself from taking the damage. So even if I don't end up ever playing the battle card, it has an extra utility in my hand that I can play defensively or offensively like that to close out the game. So it's those multiple layers of interaction that make it so that you can mitigate a lot of what the game's trying to do.
So Dragon Ball is the game, because you mentioned one of the most important aspects of card games in general that draws you to a deck is a game or a deck that generates a lot of hand advantage. So Dragon Ball is a game in which hand advantage is very important because you can use your cards as kind of extra resources in different ways. In Digimon, your hand advantage kind of comes from the act of evolving. So you kind of have a built-in draw engine through the evolution mechanic that's kind of baked into the design of the game. Do you feel that the way Digimon plays, sometimes there's a hand advantage issue where you run into a situation where if you can't evolve, you're so far behind because you can't actually recoup those cards that you've lost?
I mean, it sounds like you're asking me if I think we should have mulligans.
You said it, not me.
I think here's the thing. The thing is that it's never actually hand advantage, and that's why sometimes now the game feels really smooth when it works really well. I'm not gonna lie, Digimon feels amazing when you're able to digivolve over and over and over again because you are cycling, but it's never actually hand advantage. The way hand advantage works out in this game for most decks is that if you're able to set up perfect cycles every single turn, the card you draw in your hand means that your hand size almost permanently stays that high because every time you play a card, it replaces itself. So on my turn 1, I draw a card. Now my hand size is 6. My next turn will be 7. And then if I draw additional cards from that, it's absolute gravy because almost every card in my hand essentially says cycle 1. But that it can cause issues in that, like you said, sometimes you have breaking hands where you're just kind of playing something and it's really hard to dig yourself out of it. That's why I think like on Blue Omni, I've decided that more Zudomons is probably the way to go because you know what? The amount of times I've had to hardcast an ultimate, you know what? Why not let it actually draw me extra cards while I'm at it? So it can be a tough place in the most part, but I think it's a fun trade to have when we consider how good Digimon feels when you can dig through like half your deck like it's nothing, just because every card has cycle. It's a really interesting way to do it. I mean, I think starting to think about it as a cycle is a really good tool players can use to start actually understanding card advantage in the game. We're also seeing more Upamons being printed for other colors. We're seeing more ways to push card draw. And if Bandai follows the design space they took with Dragon Ball with Digimon, card drawing will become something more proactively available the more and more sets come. With Dragon Ball, your leader card can attack. So if you guys play Magic the Gathering, it's like if you have a commander on board the entire game. And oftentimes when your leader attacks, he actually draws you a card. It's consistent in almost every single leader in the game. In the first sets of the game, you were only able to draw when you were on the flip side of your leader, which is when you're at half life, and that's like another comeback mechanic available to the game, where your leader becomes stronger, he powers up or whatever, and then at that point you can draw cards. About set, I want to say 6 or 7. At set 6 or 7, they started making leaders that allow you to draw on their front side, making draw more available, making the game more consistent, upping the power level of the game. So I could see them go down that flow of making card draw more consistent the more the game goes. Right now, it's been mostly a blue thing, but we've seen yellow be able to get some card draw now. And I think eventually they're going to do a variety of different ways to do card draw based on color identity, which is really cool. So right now, can it be bricky? Yeah, and I think there's not enough draw spells in the game for every color to have access to an out. But I do see it going down the road of consistency being able to pump up enough that it'll mitigate for that in the future. And you have to be careful about it, right? Because like hand advantage, card draw in a game where every single card in the game says, "Oh, hey, I replaced myself," is very dangerous. So you definitely need to take that into account when you're going and trying to push for future design space in regards to card draw.
So basically, what you're saying, and based on your experience in Dragon Ball, you feel that Bandai might follow kind of the same set structure, kind of as the game progresses, because they'll kind of recognize the deficiencies and kind of print cards that otherwise would have corrected some of those deficiencies, kind of in the infancy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Digimon is their second crack at the game, right? So for any deficiencies
Fourth,
that Digimon or fourth, right? But like following Dragon Ball immediately after, um, I have to say that if there's any deficiencies with the card game, they're probably planned, just
yeah.
to keep that design space open for eventual power creep and such. But I do see them following similar trends. The way they distribute promos almost feels similar to the way they distribute promos in Dragon Ball, which I think could be a little dangerous. But for the most part, I think it's a lot of the same people working on the project, or the same building at least. A lot of the same design spaces used. So I could see if you're trying to understand trends in Digimon, I would say paying attention to what the trends were like in the early days of Dragon Ball would be a good way to understanding where they're probably moving with the game moving forward, especially as the game is moving away from Japan and becoming more global.
So the last thing I want to talk about is price, and
Yeah.
yeah, knew this was coming. So, as we know, right now, Digimon's kind of in that weird kind of middle ground because we had the pre-sale. We unfortunately haven't had the official release yet due to logistic issues. We should have technically had it, I guess, a week ago now. And
Yeah.
due to that, Digimon's kind of a scalper's market. Hopefully, when the release does come full throttle, that won't be the case anymore. Based on your experience with other Bandai properties, where do you feel the secondary market will kind of settle with Digimon as opposed to how to the general kind of average cost of cards for Dragon Ball?
I think the game will be very accessible. Dragon Ball was in its first couple of early years. Dragon Ball was hailed as um, like a build deck, a deck builder's haven, just because cards were so actually very accessible. Um, Commons, uncommons, and most just about all rares in Dragon Ball don't retain a lot of value. A lot of it sticks in the SR slot, the special rares, and I think in terms of value, once the whole distribution issue is settled, I think the prices will be very, very reasonable. Right now, like you said, we're a scalper market. A lot of people are taking advantage that people want to play the game, and unfortunately, there's no access there. The light down the tunnel being that Bandai did confirm that there will be a second wave of distribution after this first wave is done. So that's major. Super happy to hear that. Definitely helps me in feeling like this game will be inaccessible to people. Because obviously, if the prices are too ridiculous, no one's going to get into the card game. The card game's going to die. So I think the biggest trend in terms of pricing will probably be in the promos. SRs in Dragon Ball don't retain their price much. We just had the release of set 12 2 weeks ago now, and I think the most expensive SR from the set is like $10. Um, yeah, and then you take into account the fact that our booster boxes are double the size of Japanese booster boxes, making it more available for us to actually get SRs than they do. And I think the prices will be very, very reasonable. I think your competitive decks, you'd be looking at maybe spending 20 to 30 bucks per SR if it's a really competitive deck. But the prices don't stick around for too long. A month into a set's release, outside of some very key cards, the game is super accessible. However, because of the distribution model of their promos could see becoming expensive if they're like exclusive to the promos. Like Diabormon, let's say. Only available via the promo. The deck, if you want to play Diabormon deck, it is way harder to build without that promo than with it. And then how are they going to distribute that, you know? So depending on the route they take with promos, that could be where a lot of the expenditure for the game comes from. In regards to main sets and main set archetypes, and not needing promos, I think the game will become very, very accessible. Right now we're kind of in la la land where like alt art Omnimons are $180, which I think is ridiculous. At the same time, we are at like this forefront of this card game boom with like Pokemon having popped off, and now everyone thinks that if you hold a set one box of any card game, it'll be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in like a decade. Which guys, that's not happening for Digimon, but but I do see the prices coming down severely. Even now, like if you ignore the high SR prices of like purple and blue, you can build a really strong green deck for nothing. You can build a decently okay. yellow deck for nothing. And even when we get into high power level decks like a Shine Greymon next set, the expense in that deck is basically Shine Greymon. So, in
Yeah.
terms of not only the genericness of this game, which makes it really easy to tech in solutions, the only thing that you're ever going to really about having is the boss monster, right? Because the boss monster tends to be what Bandai builds archetypes around. So Shine Greymon, you need Shine Greymon. But let's say you don't have Rise Greymon. Sure, your deck is less consistent, but you can still build it in a way that's a very functional deck because of the genericness of Digimon, which is absolutely great. So you add on top of the fact that the generalness of the gameplay allows us to be able to deck build way more openly than in Dragon Ball. On top of the fact that I think in general sets don't retain a whole ton of value, I think the game will be very accessible, at least early on.
I hope so, because I want to get as many people into this as possible. I really want to see this latest push in the Digimon kind of boon and resurgence really kind of take hold and get so I can share my favorite property with everyone in the universe and grow and expand, and we will
Mm-hmm.
we will take everything over. No, no, but I'm super hyped for the game. I love it. I absolutely it's been my latest obsession and my latest passion. I mean, you can see just by making this video here. So I really hope that kind of a lot of people, when they have the ability to access that, take full advantage of that accessibility and just jump on this bandwagon with us and help us ride this train for years and years to come.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. I'm
so
very excited for the IP and extremely the same boat as you. I think this feels like they're doing it right. It feels exciting, and I'm actually shocked by how much support. And the big thing is the community push, right? People were playing this
yeah,
game before it even had an English translation, hoping that someday it would come here. So I think people love Digimon, and I think with how successful the card game was before we even had English cards, I think it's poised to do really really well. And I'm really excited for it.
absolutely. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for tonight. Did you have any questions for me before we called it?
Are you playing Omnimon next set?
I'm going to be collecting Alter S.
Okay.
Whether that becomes my deck of choice is to be determined, because right now I want to play my Angels and I want to play Shine
Okay.
because
All right.
Angels, they're my baby. Got to play my baby.
Right. Of course.
He's
Of
my
course. But otherwise, no, nothing on my end. Super excited for the card game, and super excited to be going through this journey with someone as knowledgeable about the Digimon franchise as you are. Actually, I find myself retaining a lot from discussing with you, so that's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to this journey into the card game with you as we grow the community.
Absolutely, 100%. So thanks so much, George, for taking this journey with us this evening. Thanks so much, you guys, for watching. If you like what you see here, please consider subscribing. And if you like the video, leave it a like. If you didn't like it, go ahead, do that too. But if you guys want to converse with me or have any more questions for George and myself, feel free to leave a comment as well. So this has been Mike again, aka Sanaku. This has been George, aka Espira. I will be linking all of his junk in the description, his Twitch, his YouTube, all that jazz. Make sure to check him out. Great guy, great content creator. Love to have him here. So once again, guys, take care, and we'll see you in the next one.
Ciao.